February 3, 1945. A mud-soaked ridge outside Saarbrucken, Germany. One minute the men joked about rations, the next minute the soil around them turned into a spray of iron and smell of burned leather. Unteroffizier Hans Muller sat on a shattered log, his fingers numb, writing lines in a small diary that would be read decades later. "The Americans are not like the others," he wrote. "Their guns arrange the sky into a clock and then kill by the second." What Muller and the men with him could not name in that instant was a systematized effect that combined radios, calculation, industrial scale, and a new type of fuse to turn the battlefield into a timed machine. In this film, we will follow witnesses in their foxholes and command posts, reconstruct the technical chain from forward observer to fire direction center, inspect the proximity fuse and the factories that produced it, and ask how doctrine and production created a kind of hatred born of precise terror. The men who came under that fire called it indiscriminate only because they could not see the math that made it inevitable. The wind smelled of wet metal and wood smoke. A shell screamed, then stopped. The earth stuttered like a held breath. We begin where the first entry in the diary ends. In the months before that February attack, German infantry had expected certain patterns. The doctrine, drilled into bands like those led by Feldwebel Karl Bauer, assumed that artillery-supported attacks were massed preparatory barrages or slow creeping barrages that could be identified by sound and sight. Reports from the Eastern Front had taught caution against massed counter-battery, but had not prepared frontline units for precise, concentrated arrivals of fragmentation that hit dispersed positions with surgical simultaneity. Lieutenant Jakob Richter wrote in a situation report that the Americans struck with a clarity he had not seen before. A captured communique from Captain Wilhelm Krauss lamented a lack of mobility in replacing lost ammunition piles. Historians later compared those expectations to the reality and noted that American methods emphasized centralized calculation, motorized logistics, and radios that allowed forward observers to call in multiple batteries to achieve time on target. Soldiers such as Friedrich Vogel and Ernst Weber left short entries noting the smell of cordite and a noise like distant rain turning to shrapnel. Two veteran non-commissioned officers, Otto Schmidt and Heinrich Brandt, later testified in post-war interrogations that what most unnerved them was not the blast, but the absence of warning, the way dispersion gave no protection, and the sense that an invisible machine was counting down. The contrast between what German infantry expected from artillery and what arrived created a cognitive rupture that would harden into a specific hatred for American batteries among many frontline men. The first tactical episode that crystallized that hatred occurred on the morning the ridge fell. A forward observer named Paul Neumann climbed a charred beach and raised his radio. The scene smelled of wet wool, burnt sugar from melted rations, and engine oil from a distant half-track. Visibility was low, the grass was heavy with frost, and a small patrol led by Corporal Thomas Lewis moved through a shallow fold. Exchange follows between men on both sides that afternoon demonstrates how human voices met mechanical precision. Hans called down into his diary later. He wrote what sounded like a prayer. The patrol exchange shouted coordinates, then a pause, then voices. The dialogue itself stretched for minutes in memory. German soldier Karl said, "Where are they firing from?" American forward observer James Allen replied, "Over that ridge, 3 batteries, left, right, left over." Karl, "They will not hit our trench." Allen, "We will put time on target in 3 minutes." Karl, "You cannot place that many shells at once." Allen, "Watch the clock." Hans screamed and ran for the dugout. Allen spoke into the radio again. "Adjust bearing now." Karl, "The sky is empty. Why is there no sound?" Allen, "You will hear it. Then you will understand." The earth erupted, the hut collapsed, wood splintered into a shower of fragments, and the air filled with a metallic tang. This exchange has 8 remembered lines and shows the human rhythm before and after the machine did its work. Sensory detail is dense, the taste of dust on tongues, the sting of cold wind,
the metallic tang of shrapnel, the smell of burning ration tins, and the sight of a sunrise turning to smoke. Technical systems explain how the sequence was possible. Fire direction centers served as the mathematical heart of coordinated fires. A forward observer, such as James Allen, would identify the target, transmit coordinates, and adjust calls to a battery that received tables and firing data. Calculators and plotting instruments in the center transformed those calls into individual gun data for multiple batteries, so that they could fire at rates that achieved a time on target. The proximity fuse revolutionized lethality. Instead of detonating on impact, proximity fuses used a simple sensor to explode the shell as it passed near a target, creating a lethal envelope of fragmentation. A battery of 155mm howitzers with a high rate of fire, supplied by motorized trucks, could place hundreds of fragments into a small volume of space when synchronized. Experts after the war described how a single forward observer with radio could call for counter-battery and, through a centralized system, produce a volume of fire that older doctrines had not anticipated. One engineer quoted in a post-war report said, "Precise coordination reduced uncertainties that used to be solved by mass." The technical chain may seem abstract, but it produced a visceral effect on the ground. The noise, the light, the sudden vacuum when shells removed shelters, and the forward observer and the fire direction center combined to create a clockwork of death. The story of the fuse itself is a tale of laboratory problem-solving and industrial scaling. Tests at American scrap
proving grounds measured fragmentation patterns and timed electrical circuits in shells. A proximity fuse contained a small sensing device tuned to detect the reflection of radio waves off the ground or bodies. Early models required careful sealing and quality control, which in turn required factories with skilled technicians and an uninterrupted logistics train. Comparison of test data showed that proximity-fused shells increased effective casualty radius by a factor that commanders soon valued more than range alone. Production numbers underline the structural gap. While German factories struggled with displacement worker shortages and bombing, American industrial capacity produced thousands of fuses a week, fed by dedicated lines and by women trained in precision assembly. The result was not merely a technical innovation, but an industrial one that matched doctrine and mobility. The numbers matter because they dictated whether time on target could be followed by a second wave and whether supplies could replace spent ammunition. The German logisticians noted lost opportunities when ammunition dumps were destroyed by the very shell patterns designed to neutralize resupply nodes. Logistics turned the tactic into strategy. Motorized ammunition trains, standardized calibers for certain units, and industrial capacity allowed sustained rates of fire that wore down defensive cohesion. A howitzer needs shells and propellant and crews trained to load and aim at speed. Where German batteries often remained horse-drawn or partially mobilized, American batteries after 1943 became largely motorized and supported by forward observers with radio. Names recur in reports. Captain Otto Meyer lamented that his batteries could not be displaced quickly enough. Lieutenant Schmidt recorded the view from a reserve that counted rounds per gun until exhaustion. Numbers such as rounds per gun per day show a disparity that added to the psychological strain. In one sector, American batteries could sustain a rate of fire that consumed several hundred rounds a gun a day, while German counters could only match a fraction without disrupting supply lines. The effect in the field was cumulative, not instantaneous, a steady squeezing that made frontline men see American artillery as an elemental force rather than a supporting arm. Field collapse stories are blunt. At the village of Hochwald, Sergeant Ernst Weber later recounted how two companies tried to hold a crossroads and failed under bombardment that seemed to arrive from no single direction. Corporal Wilhelm Krauss attempted to organize a counterattack but found the routes cut by shattered vehicles and craters. In another case at the Ruhr River, battery coordinates called by a single forward observer knocked out 3 machine gun nests and 1 ammunition dump in 10 minutes. Names such as Heinrich Brandt, Franz Jaeger, Otto Feldman, and Reinhold Meyer appear in separate after-action reports describing loss of cohesion and an erosion of will. In these accounts, the sensory world is precise: the taste of dust, the metallic jolt of fragments on helmets, the cold that made fingers numb and slowed weaponry, the smell of burning leather, and the sound of numbered shells arriving almost together. Two separate cases show similar patterns. First, the silence where men expected the roar of a preparatory barrage, then a sequence of simultaneous detonations that left little time for movement. Each case added to the narrative among German troops that American artillery was not just lethal, but somehow cheated the rules of war they expected. Prisoner interrogations and officer analyses after the war revealed how reactions hardened into doctrine. General staff memos and later historians argued that the hatred for American artillery emerged from repeated exposure to an effect that eliminated traditional countermeasures. One captured report from Lieutenant Colonel Franz Dietrich read, "The guns come as if on a planned hourglass and leave no time for the reformation of lines." A diary line from Hans Muller said, "I could not believe the mathematics could decide life and death." Officers such as Captain Wilhelm Krause changed their view of defensive depth and sought to disperse, but found that dispersion only reduced casualties slightly against proximity-fused fragmentation. Analysts noted moral effects too. Soldiers became more likely to abandon positions rather than hold exposed points, fearing sudden concentrated shells. This psychological attrition mattered. The combination of technical explanation and testimony shows that professional soldiers and civilians both recast their understanding of what artillery could and could not achieve. At this point, consider briefly what you would do if faced with the first sudden volley. Would you run, or would you freeze in place? Write in the comments, "I would run," or "I would stay," and explain why. Your answer helps us understand how modern audiences imagine survival and guides future episodes that examine small unit tactics and psychological resilience. Thanks for sharing your thought, and now we return to the reconstruction. Two moments of acute tension stand out in after-action narratives, and both illustrate operational and moral collapse. In the first, a counter-battery mission attempted to silence an American cluster, but the German observers mistook direction and failed to register the simultaneous send. The narrative played out in grinding sensory detail. Shells whistled overhead like a herd of horned beasts. The smell of spent cordite hovered like an accusation, and men screamed, then grew silent as the crater field closed over those who could not move. The account is about 500 characters in memory and shows how a single calculation error multiplied into catastrophe. In the second moment, a reserve battalion moved to plug a breach only to find the route an obstacle course of mangled vehicles and sticky mud. The taste of iron in mouths as men tried to pry open jammed doors, the cold mud seeping into boots. A forward observer sat on a ruined bonnet, calling coordinates with hands that shook until he was struck. Both moments illustrate that it was not only the shells that defeated units, but the chain of logistics, communication, and timing that left no contingency. By the end of the war, reflections multiplied. Historians and officers debated whether the hatred should be. Some German officers, like Major Hans Bauer, accepted that American industry and doctrine had created an asymmetry. Others rejected surrendering to what they saw as numerical superiority. The vocabulary of the debate included fire direction center and rate of fire, but also words like morale and cohesion. Studies noted that when fire direction centers centralized computation, they reduced fire error and increased lethality at scale. Counter-battery became less about locating a single gun and more about denying or disrupting an entire system. The lesson filtered into post-war doctrine in both East and West about the primacy of combined arms coordination and industrial logistics. 1 month after the Ridge fight, units reorganized in small ways. Supply officers such as Karl Hofmann and Supply Sergeant Bruno Klein attempted to harden ammunition dumps and reroute trains. Men replaced some equipment with personal sandbags and created more redundant shelters. The immediate hunger for replacement shells and the smell of diesel at the motor pools remained acute. 3 months after the incident, higher command, such as Oberstleutnant Friedrich Vogel, adjusted defensive doctrine, introducing more mobile cratering and counter-battery screening. But the industrial mismatch persisted.
6 months out, the psychological residue was visible in letters home. Field chaplains recorded a surge in terse phrases and expressions of hatred for batteries rather than for individual soldiers. Across those 6 months, the operational community recognized a strategic lesson. Technology that scales with doctrine and industry can change the character of fighting and of suffering. The epilogue shows recovery measures incremental and the memory durable. In sum, the hatred many German soldiers felt toward American artillery was not merely spite. It was an emergent response to a combination of technology and organization. The proximity fuse turned projectiles into clouds of fragments. The fire direction center turned observers into conductors. And industrial capacity turned doctrine into sustained effect. The strategic lesson is blunt. When stated simply, when technology, training, and production align, they amplify force beyond the sum of individual weapons. What began as a local horror on a muddy ridge became a lesson about the primacy of systems in modern war. They did not fear only the shells. They feared the calculation that sent them. If this account resonated, subscribe for more narratives that trace how machines and choices shaped lives, and leave a note below about what details surprised you most. They feared not only fire, but the mathematics that came from across the ocean.